Some stories are buried so deep in the soil of American history that they were never meant to be found. The tale of the Sager family's journey west in 1844 is one such story. A narrative of hope transformed into horror, of innocent lives scattered to the winds of fate, of systematic erasure from official records. What you're about to discover was deliberately obscured, the evidence meticulously dismantled by those who feared its implications. They thought time would finish what their censorship began. They were wrong. The dust-choked wagon ruts that once marked the Oregon Trail have long since vanished beneath highways and housing developments, but buried beneath that domesticated landscape lies a trail of blood and secrets. The Sager tragedy wasn't simply another sad story of pioneer misfortune. It was the beginning of a pattern that would repeat itself again and again across the American frontier, a pattern few have recognized and fewer still have dared to expose. This isn't just history. It's a living architecture of exploitation that continues to shape our world, hidden in plain sight for those who know where to look. You stand now at the threshold of a terrible knowledge. Once you cross it, you cannot return to comfortable ignorance. The markers of this hidden system will become visible to you everywhere, in courthouse records and land deeds, in orphanage registries and probate filings, in the suspicious clustering of family tragedies around valuable assets. The veil, once lifted, cannot be lowered again. Are you prepared for what this means? Are you ready to see the world as it truly is, rather than as our sanitized histories have presented it? You've likely never heard the true account of the Sager family, how 7 children watched both their parents perish on the merciless trail west, how they found brief sanctuary with missionaries Marcus and Narcissa Whitman, only to witness a massacre that would claim their new parents and 2 of their siblings. You've never heard how the 4 surviving Sager girls were scattered to the winds, carrying with them a terrible knowledge that some would spend their lives trying to forget, while others fought desperately to preserve it. You've never heard how one survivor, decades later, would piece together the fragments of this shattered family history, only to discover connections to a web of horror stretching across generations, a web that remains active even now, silently claiming new victims while our attention is carefully directed elsewhere. The story begins simply enough. In the spring of 1844, Henry Sager, a restless blacksmith who had already moved his family 3 times across the expanding American frontier, decided to join the Great Western Migration. Loading their possessions into a covered wagon at St. Joseph, Missouri, Henry, his pregnant wife Naomi, and their 6 children, John, Francis, Catherine, Elizabeth, Matilda, and Louisa, joined a wagon train called the Independent Colony under the leadership of Captain William Shaw. What isn't recorded in conventional histories is that the Sagers' decision wasn't entirely voluntary. Henry had discovered irregularities in land transactions at the county recorder's office, where he occasionally did metalwork repairs. Certain properties belonging to deceased settlers had been transferred under suspicious circumstances to a consortium of investors with connections to territorial officials. Henry had mentioned his concerns to a local judge, who advised him to forget what he'd seen. 3 days later, their barn burned to the ground. A week after that, their youngest daughter fell mysteriously ill. The doctor called it summer fever, but the symptoms matched no disease Henry had ever witnessed. She recovered, but the message was clear. It was time to move on. The Sagers converted their remaining assets to gold coins, which Naomi carefully sewed into the lining of Henry's coat and the hems of her petticoats. They told neighbors they were heading to California, but at the last moment joined the Independent Colony bound for Oregon instead. Henry had relatives who had settled near Fort Vancouver the previous year, though they had recently fallen silent after months of regular correspondence. The Sagers hoped to find security in this new territory, distant from the reach of whoever had forced them from their Missouri home. The trail stretched before them like a serpent's back, winding through landscapes of breathtaking beauty and terrifying desolation. 2,000 miles of possibility and peril. For the children, ranging in age from 3 to 13, the journey began as an adventure, sleeping under canvas at night, watching buffalo herds thunder across the plains by day. gathering around campfires where fiddle music and laughter temporarily masked the anxiety that gripped many of the adults. Catherine Sager would later recall how her father seemed to relax as they put more distance between themselves and Missouri. He smiled more frequently, joined in the evening singing, and spoke with animation about the farm they would establish in Oregon. Only Naomi remained wary, startling at unexpected sounds and keeping the younger children close. She had sensed something her husband had not. That distance alone couldn't protect them from whatever forces had driven them west. What the Sager children couldn't know was that the Oregon Trail was already developing its grim reputation as the longest graveyard in America. 1 in 10 who set out would never reach their destination. Disease, accidents, starvation, exposure, and occasionally violence claimed lives with ruthless impartiality. The trail was littered with hastily dug graves, abandoned possessions, and the bleached bones of oxen. Yet still they came, drawn by promises of fertile land and fresh beginnings in a territory not yet part of the United States. More ominous still was a pattern that wouldn't be recognized until decades later. A statistical anomaly of family deaths that defied explanation. Certain wagon trains suffered mortality rates far exceeding the norm, particularly among families traveling with substantial assets. These deaths were invariably attributed to natural causes, disease, accidents, exposure, but they clustered around families with specific characteristics: skilled tradesmen, professionals, merchants with liquid capital, families without connections in the new territory. The Sagers fit this profile perfectly. Catherine Sager, 9 years old when the journey began, would later recount how the early days on the trail seemed almost festive. "The first encampments were a great pleasure to us children," she wrote in her account years later, but the festive atmosphere would not last. 5 weeks into the journey, on May 30th, 1844, Naomi gave birth to their 7th child in present-day Kansas, a girl they named Henrietta. The birth weakened Naomi considerably, but the wagon train could not afford to linger. The mountains had to be crossed before winter snows made passage impossible. The first subtle signs of the pattern that would engulf the Sagers appeared shortly after Henrietta's birth. Items began to disappear from their wagon. First small tools, then a silver hairbrush that had been a wedding gift to Naomi, then a pouch containing medicinal herbs. Henry initially attributed the losses to carelessness or the jostling of the wagon, but Naomi suspected otherwise. She began keeping their most valuable possessions on her person at all times. Then came the first clear manifestation of malevolent design. The Sagers, oxen, previously healthy and strong, suddenly fell ill after drinking from a stream where the rest of the company's animals had suffered no ill effects. 2 died within hours, displaying symptoms consistent with poisoning. Henry purchased replacements from another family at exorbitant cost, depleting their ready cash reserves. No one openly accused anyone of foul play, but Catherine remembered overhearing her father telling her mother, "Someone wants us destitute when we arrive," or not to arrive at all. As they traveled along the Platte River in Nebraska, celebrating Independence Day on July 4th with the other pioneers, disaster struck. While crossing the South Platte River, the Sagers' wagon overturned, and Naomi was badly injured. Though she survived, she would never fully recover, and the family pressed on with increasing difficulty. What Catherine's published account doesn't mention is that just before the crossing, 2 men she didn't recognize had briefly inspected the Sagers' wagon. They spoke with the wagon master, nodded, and moved on. During the crossing, she observed one of these men watching from the riverbank, making no move to assist as the wagon tipped and her mother was pinned beneath the shifting cargo. When she mentioned this to her father later, he forbade her from speaking of it again, though she noticed that he began keeping his rifle closer at hand. The second catastrophe occurred weeks later. Catherine, attempting to jump from the moving wagon, caught her dress on an axe handle and fell beneath the heavy wheels. Her leg was broken in multiple places, an injury that could easily have proven fatal under frontier conditions. A German physician traveling with the company, known only as Dr. Dagon, set the fracture and thereafter rode in the Sager wagon to monitor Catherine's condition. She would spend the remainder of the journey confined to the wagon bed, watching the sky change through the oval opening of the canvas cover, listening to the creaking wheels marking out the rhythm of their westward progress. Dr. Dagon's sudden interest in the Sager family extended beyond Catherine's medical care. He began taking meals with them, asking detailed questions about their plans in Oregon, the resources they carried, the contacts they expected to meet. Henry welcomed the doctor's company but volunteered little specific information. Naomi remained reserved, answering questions with questions of her own. The doctor seemed particularly interested in the Sager children, commenting on their intelligence and health in ways that Catherine, even at 9 years old, found unsettling. "Such fine children," he remarked to Naomi one evening as the younger ones played near the campfire. "So adaptable. Children can thrive in the most diverse circumstances, wouldn't you agree? Even when fate takes unexpected turns." By August, the wagon train had reached the Continental Divide. The worst of the terrain lay behind them, but a more insidious threat had emerged within the company, an outbreak of what they called camp fever, most likely typhoid. When they reached the Green River, in what is now Wyoming, Henry Sager fell gravely ill. Knowing death was imminent, he called for Captain Shaw and, with tears streaming down his face, begged the man to ensure his family reached Oregon safely. What the historical record doesn't show is that Henry also gave Shaw specific instructions about the gold coins sewn into his clothing. "Give them only to my wife," he insisted. "No one else. If she too should fall, then to John, my eldest. The children will need it to establish themselves." The next day, Henry Sager was buried in a shallow grave on the banks of the Green River. The company paused only long enough to construct a crude coffin and speak a few words over it before the wagons rolled on. There was no time for extended mourning on the Oregon Trail. Winter was coming. Catherine would later recall that when her father's body was prepared for burial, he was dressed in clothing she didn't recognize. His coat, the coat containing half of their gold reserves, had disappeared. When Naomi questioned this, she was told that his clothes had been burned as a precaution against the spread of disease. No one had thought to check the lining first. Naomi, weakened by childbirth, injury, and now grief, soon succumbed to the same fever that had claimed her husband. According to Catherine's account, her mother's final days were marked by delirium. She talked of her husband, addressing him as though present, beseeching him in piteous tones to relieve her sufferings. The women of the company did what they could for her, washing the dust from her face and making her as comfortable as possible. The baby Henrietta was passed from one nursing mother to another. In her lucid moments, Naomi called for Catherine. "Remember everything," she whispered. "Remember who we are. Remember what your father said about the papers in his trunk. When you're grown, find them." Catherine promised, though she had no idea what papers her mother meant. The trunk had already been ransacked during their journey, its contents simplified to reduce weight as their oxen weakened. On the morning after Naomi's death near what is now the Idaho border, the children were permitted one last look at their mother's face before her body was consigned to the earth. Then the wagons moved on, leaving another unmarked grave by the trail. Naomi's petticoats, with their secreted gold coins, were not buried with her. They had been respectfully removed and set aside, supposedly to be kept for her daughters. Those petticoats, and the fortune they contained, vanished within days. When John Sager inquired about them, he was advised to focus on keeping his siblings alive rather than on trinkets and fripperies. 7 children, ages 14 years to 3 months, were now orphaned in the wilderness, still hundreds of miles from their destination. What happened next revealed both the compassion and the practicality of frontier society. The entire company shared responsibility for the children's care, with Captain Shaw taking primary guardianship. He divided his last loaf of bread to feed them when provisions ran low. But even as the wagon train's families shared what little they had, plans were being made for the children's future, plans that prioritized expedience over their parents' wishes. Dr. Dagon suggested separating the siblings, placing them with different families based on the needs of each potential guardian, rather than the bonds between the children. "The older boys can work as farmhands," he proposed. "The girls can help with domestic duties. The infant will need a nursing mother. John Sager, just 14 but determined to honor his father's dying request that the family remain together, resisted. "We stay together or we die together," he declared. His defiance earned him both admiration and resentment among the company's adults. Some saw nobility in his stance. Others saw only an obstinate child interfering with practical solutions. As they approached the Snake River, the Sagers' wagon was converted to a cart to accommodate their weakening oxen. All possessions deemed non-essential were abandoned by the trail. Survival had become the only consideration. Among the items discarded was a small wooden box of Naomi's, containing family letters and documents. Catherine, remembering her mother's final words, protested the box's abandonment. "It's nothing but paper," she was told. "Paper won't feed you or keep you warm." When the company reached Fort Bridger, Captain Shaw learned of a mission station in the Walla Walla Valley, run by Marcus and Narcissa Whitman. The Whitmans were known to take in orphan children, and Shaw sent word ahead asking if they would accept the Sager orphans. The reply came back in the affirmative. What Shaw didn't include in his message to the Whitmans was that the Sager children might bring trouble with them. 2 men had appeared at Fort Bridger the day after the company's arrival, asking specifically about the orphans from Missouri. When Shaw questioned their interest, they claimed to be distant relatives concerned for the children's welfare. Their description of the Sagers was accurate, but something in their manner raised Shaw's suspicions. He told them the children had been sent north with another party. The men departed immediately in that direction. Shaw accelerated the Sagers' journey to the Whitman mission, sending them ahead with a smaller party while the main company rested at Fort Bridger. "Get them there quickly and quietly," he instructed the party's leader. "Something isn't right about those men." In October 1844, after 6 months and 2,000 miles, the Sager children reached the Whitman mission at Wailatpu. For Narcissa Whitman, their arrival seemed almost providential. She had lost her only biological child, 2-year-old Alice, to a drowning accident in 1839. Since then, she had taken in several children but continued to mourn her daughter. The 7 Sager children offered her a chance to rebuild the family she had lost. Marcus Whitman, a physician who had established the mission in 1836 to bring Christianity to the Cayuse people, was particularly interested in adopting the 2 Sager boys. Initially, the Whitmans considered taking only 3 of the children, but Captain Shaw insisted they not be separated. In July 1845, Dr. Whitman obtained legal custody of all 7. The Whitmans knew nothing of the Sagers' flight from Missouri or the suspicious circumstances surrounding their parents' deaths. To them, the children were simply unfortunate orphans of the trail, one family among many broken by the hardships of the journey west. They were unaware that by taking in the Sagers, they had inserted themselves into a pattern of predation that would eventually claim their own lives. For 3 years, the Sager children lived with the Whitmans, adapting to their new home and family. Catherine's broken leg healed, though it would remain shorter than the other for the rest of her life. The older children attended school and helped with chores. Baby Henrietta thrived under Narcissa's care. During this time, John Sager continued to search for answers about his parents' deaths. He corresponded with Captain Shaw and others from their wagon train, asking pointed questions about the disposition of his family's possessions, particularly the items containing hidden gold. He received vague replies, or none at all. Several letters were returned unopened, marked "Addressee unknown" or "No longer at this direction," despite having been sent to established addresses. John shared his suspicions with Dr. Whitman, who initially dismissed them as the imaginings of a boy struggling to accept the random cruelty of frontier life. "Death needs no conspiracy to find us on the trail," Whitman explained. "Disease and accident are explanation enough." But as John persisted, presenting the pattern of suspicious events surrounding his parents' deaths, Whitman began to listen more carefully. In the summer of 1847, Whitman made a journey east, ostensibly to address matters related to the mission's funding. Before departing, he had a private conversation with Narcissa that Catherine overheard fragments of. "If what the boy suspects is true," Whitman said, "then others should be warned. Families are still coming." The same could happen again, but a shadow was growing over the Whitman mission. As more wagon trains arrived, bringing disease and disruption to the Cayuse way of life, tensions mounted. The delicate balance of power and trust that had allowed the mission to function was eroding. In 1847, when a measles epidemic decimated the Cayuse population while most white settlers recovered, suspicion turned to rage. What historians haven't adequately explained is why the Cayuse, who had maintained relatively peaceful relations with the Whitmans for over a decade, chose that particular moment to attack. The measles epidemic was a factor, certainly, but contemporary accounts suggest that strangers had been seen speaking with certain Cayuse leaders in the weeks before the attack, men who were neither missionaries nor regular traders, who came and went under cover of darkness. These men reportedly spoke of the Whitmans as betrayers who deliberately spread disease among the native population. On November 29, 1847, a group of Cayuse warriors attacked the mission. Marcus Whitman was among the first killed, struck down with a tomahawk as he sat reading in his home. Narcissa was shot while standing by a window. When the violence ended, 14 people were dead, including both Whitmans and the two oldest Sager boys, John and Francis. The women and children were taken captive. For a month, they lived as prisoners, performing domestic labor for their captors and witnessing further horrors. During this time, 6-year-old Louisa Sager contracted measles and died, becoming the third Sager child lost to the frontier. The remaining captives, including Catherine, Elizabeth, Matilda, and baby Henrietta, were eventually ransomed by the Hudson's Bay Company, which paid 62 blankets, 63 cotton shirts, 12 rifles, 600 loads of ammunition, 7 pounds of tobacco, and 12 flints for their freedom. The 4 surviving Sager girls were brought to Oregon City and separated, placed with different families throughout the Willamette Valley. The official narrative portrayed the Whitman massacre as a straightforward case of Native American treachery, fueled by superstition and resentment. This version of events served multiple purposes. It justified harsh reprisals against the Cayuse and other tribes. It reinforced the portrayal of white settlers as innocent victims of savage aggression. And most importantly, it diverted attention from questions John Sager had been asking about patterns of exploitation targeting vulnerable families on the frontier. With John dead and his siblings separated, there was no one left to pursue those questions, or so those responsible believed. They underestimated the tenacity of Catherine Sager and the detailed mental record she had kept of everything that had happened to her family. The dispersal of the Sager sisters marked the beginning of the most mysterious chapter in their story. Catherine, the eldest surviving sister, married Clark Pringle, a Methodist minister, in 1856 and had 8 children of her own. Around 1860, she began writing a detailed account of her family's journey west and their time with the Whitmans. Her motivation, beyond preserving her family history, was to raise funds for an orphanage in Narcissa Whitman's memory. But Catherine never found a publisher willing to print her manuscript, or, more accurately, she found several publishers initially eager to print her account, only to withdraw their interest after mysterious interventions. One printer's shop burned to the ground the night before her manuscript was to be typeset. Another publisher received a visit from a quote, banking representative, who informed him that his outstanding loans would be called in if he proceeded with publication. A third simply returned the manuscript with a terse note citing, quote, concerns about factual accuracy and potential legal liability. The common element in Catherine's manuscript that triggered this suppression was her detailed reconstruction of the events leading to her parents' deaths, not just the fact of their dying, but the suspicious patterns surrounding those deaths. She had recorded every detail of their journey with a child's observant eye, the visitors to their wagon, the inexplicable illness of their oxen, the disappearance of the gold-laden clothing, the strange man asking about them at Fort Bridger. Individually, each incident could be dismissed as the normal friction of frontier travel. Collectively, they suggested something far more sinister. Even more dangerous were the connections Catherine had begun to make between her family's experience and similar cases she had discovered through careful research. She had located other orphans of the trail, now grown, whose parents had died under comparable circumstances. She had traced the redistribution of assets from these orphaned families to the same network of recipients: land agents, bankers, territorial officials, certain founding families of Oregon, whose patriarchs had been mysteriously enriched during the early settlement period. Most alarming to those who intercepted her manuscript was Catherine's documentation of how the pattern continued. New families arriving with assets still experienced, quote, frontier misfortune at statistically improbable rates. Children were still separated from parents through death or legal intervention. Resources still flowed to the same beneficiaries. The methodology had become more sophisticated, more insulated from detection, but the essential mechanism remained unchanged. Elizabeth married and settled near Forest Grove, Oregon. Unlike her sister Catherine, Elizabeth responded to trauma by retreating into silence. She never spoke of the journey west or the massacre, not even to her own children. When asked about her childhood, she would change the subject or claim not to remember. But her nightmares told a different story. Her husband reported that she would wake screaming about the men who watch us and the gold in the coats. On her deathbed in 1911, she finally broke her silence, whispering to her eldest daughter, "Find Catherine's papers." The truth is there. Matilda married Lewis Hazlitt in 1857 and moved to a homestead near Salem. After his death from cancer in 1863, she married again and relocated to Farmington, Washington, where she invested in a hotel and other businesses. Widowed a second time, she married David Delaney in 1889. Unlike her sisters, Matilda achieved significant financial success and social standing. This protected position allowed her to make discreet inquiries about certain land transactions in Oregon Territory during the 1840s and early 1850s. She discovered that multiple properties originally claimed by families who had died on the trail had been acquired by a syndicate of investors through suspiciously uniform probate proceedings. The same judge had presided over dozens of these cases. The same witness had testified to the absence of surviving relatives. The same land agent had facilitated the transfers. When Matilda attempted to access the original probate records for closer examination, she was informed they had been destroyed in a courthouse fire in 1862. When she sought shipping manifests that might document the assets these families had brought west, she learned those too had been lost to fire, flood, or simple administrative misplacement. At every turn, the documentary evidence that might have substantiated the pattern Catherine had identified had been systematically eliminated. Henrietta, the baby born on the trail, reportedly died at age 26, supposedly shot by an outlaw in a case of mistaken identity, though records of her death are suspiciously incomplete. Witnesses to the shooting gave conflicting accounts. The outlaw was never identified or apprehended. Most tellingly, Henrietta had recently begun asking questions similar to those that had occupied her older sisters, spurred by fragments of family history shared by Catherine during a rare reunion of the surviving Sagers. The official narrative ends here, with the 4 surviving sisters scattered across the Northwest, their remarkable story of survival fading into the backdrop of frontier history. But the official narrative is just the beginning. What isn't recorded in conventional histories is that Catherine Sager's manuscript contained details that powerful interests in the terror. Her account of the Whitman massacre deviated significantly from the version promoted by American authorities, who used the incident to justify harsh punitive measures against native populations throughout the region. Catherine's manuscript suggested that the measles epidemic that triggered the attack had not occurred naturally, but had been deliberately introduced. A form of primitive biological warfare deployed by certain frontier elements who stood to profit from the removal of both missionaries and natives from valuable lands. According to Catherine, Dr. Whitman had discovered evidence of this plot shortly before the massacre and had been preparing to report it to authorities in the East. More disturbing still were Catherine's observations about several men who had visited the mission in the weeks before the attack. Men whose names would later appear as prominent founders of Portland, Seattle, and other Northwest cities. These men, Catherine claimed, had held private meetings with Marcus Whitman, after which he appeared deeply troubled and began making arrangements to send sensitive documents east with the next supply train. Those documents never reached their destination. The attack occurred before they could be dispatched, and in the chaos that followed, they vanished. So too did several pages from Catherine's original manuscript, pages that contained physical descriptions and names of these mysterious visitors. What remained of Catherine's account passed through her children's hands after her death in 1910. Her granddaughter, Cornelia Shields, attempted to publish the complete manuscript in the 1950s, but encountered the same resistance Catherine had faced a century earlier. Certain influential Northwest families, descendants of the men Catherine had named, used legal threats and financial pressure to block publication. Shields didn't give up. She began researching other orphans from the Oregon Trail era, looking for patterns, for connections. What she discovered was chilling. Between 1843 and 1858, at least 27 families traveling the Oregon Trail lost both parents to seemingly natural causes: disease, accidents, exposure. In every case, the orphan children were taken in by established settlers or missionaries. In every case, the families had been traveling with significant assets, money, titles to land in the East that could be sold, valuable skills or professions. And in nearly every case, those assets mysteriously diminished or disappeared entirely once the parents died. Shields documented how these orphaned children were systematically separated from any documentation of their parents' assets. Family Bibles with birth and marriage records disappeared. Letters and diaries vanished. Legal papers were lost in transit. The children were told their parents had arrived destitute, when witnesses from the same wagon trains reported otherwise. More disturbing still, Shields found that many of these orphan children died young, or disappeared from historical records entirely. Those who survived often suffered strange accidents or unexpected illnesses in early adulthood, particularly those who began asking questions about their parents, deaths, or the disposition of family assets. The pattern extended beyond the Oregon Trail. Similar clusters of orphaned children appeared in the California gold rush, the Colorado mining boom, and later settlement waves in Montana and Idaho. Always the same elements: parents with assets, mysterious deaths attributed to natural causes, children distributed to established families, fortunes that vanished. Shields was preparing to publish her findings in 1962 when she died in what was ruled an accidental house fire. Her research notes were reportedly destroyed in the blaze. All except one microfilmed copy of Catherine's original manuscript, which had been secretly deposited in a university archive under a misleading title. That microfilm was discovered in 1978 by a graduate student researching women's narratives of the frontier experience. The student, Ellen Carver, recognized the significance of what she'd found and began her own investigation, tracking down descendants of the Sager sisters and other Oregon Trail orphans. Carver's research led her to a network of families across the Northwest who shared similar histories. Ancestors orphaned under suspicious circumstances. Family assets that vanished, persistent questions discouraged by subtle or explicit threats. Most had stopped asking those questions generations ago, accepting the sanitized version of their family histories promoted by official sources. But they had preserved fragments of the truth in private family documents, in stories passed down orally, in coded references that wouldn't trigger outside interference. What emerged was a shadow history of the American frontier, a systematic pattern of exploitation in which vulnerable families were targeted, parents eliminated, and children absorbed into established communities where their inheritance could be quietly appropriated. The network responsible wasn't a formal organization, but rather a loose affiliation of opportunists who recognized the potential for profit in the chaos of westward expansion. These frontier predators developed a methodology that evolved over time. In the earliest phase, exemplified by the Sager case, the approach was relatively crude. isolated incidents of sabotage and poisoning masked by the general hazards of the trail. Later iterations became more sophisticated, employing legal mechanisms like questionable probate proceedings, manipulated guardianship arrangements, and fraudulent property transfers. By the late 19th century, the system had become institutionalized, embedded within the legitimate structures of frontier governance and commerce. Banks, land offices, territorial courts, and eventually state agencies all served as vectors for the continued extraction of wealth from vulnerable families. The specific techniques changed, but the underlying process remained the same: identify targets, eliminate obstacles, whether physical or legal, secure control of assets, and suppress any investigation of the pattern. Carver's research revealed that Matilda Sager had known or suspected some of this. After her third marriage to David Delaney in 1889, she gained financial security and social standing that gave her a measure of protection. She began making discreet inquiries about her parents, deaths, and the fate of their possessions, which had included substantial cash reserves sewn into the lining of Henry Sager's coat, money that was never accounted for after his death. Matilda's inquiries were met with polite deflection and, increasingly, subtle threats. In 1897, when a proposal surfaced to remove the victims' remains from the Whitman Mission to Whitman College, Matilda publicly opposed it, calling it an act of vandalism. Her opposition wasn't merely sentimental. She suspected that examination of the remains might reveal inconvenient truths about how some of the victims had actually died. The most significant discovery in Carver's research was evidence that the pattern identified by Catherine Sager and traced through subsequent generations by Shields had not ended with the closing of the frontier. It had simply adapted to new conditions, finding fresh opportunities for predation in each new phase of American development. During the Great Depression, Carver documented clusters of bank foreclosures that targeted specific demographic groups, families with substantial equity in their properties, but without political connections or extended family networks. These foreclosures followed suspicious patterns. Loan terms suddenly changed, payments mysteriously misapplied, paperwork lost, then found, with alterations. Children from these displaced families often ended up in orphanages or foster care, despite having extended family willing to take them in. In the post-World War II era, the pattern shifted to urban renewal programs that disproportionately displaced certain communities, particularly those with increasing property values but limited political influence. Again, families were scattered, assets undervalued and appropriated, children separated from support networks that might have preserved their inheritance rights. By the 1970s, the methodology had become even more sophisticated, employing complex financial instruments and regulatory capture to achieve the same basic outcome: the identification of vulnerable families with assets, the engineered removal of adult protectors, the separation of children from their inheritance, and the appropriation of resources by the same network of. The man expressed great interest in her work and offered substantial funding to expand her research, with one condition: she would need to share her sources and conclusions with the Society's review board before publication. Carver agreed. 3 months later, Carver's academic position was terminated due to budget cuts. Her research materials were confiscated by the university for alleged violations of archive access protocols. Her academic reputation was quietly but effectively undermined through rumors of methodological sloppiness and fabricated sources. The Historical Preservation Society that had approached her turned out to be a recently formed entity with no physical address, funded through a series of shell companies, ultimately linked to several prominent Northwest families. The same families Catherine Sager had identified in her manuscript a century earlier. The predatory system hadn't just survived, it had evolved, developing sophisticated mechanisms to protect itself from exposure. Carver abandoned academia and relocated to a small town in northern Idaho, where she lived until her death in 2012. She never published her findings on the Sager family or the broader pattern of Oregon Trail orphans. But she did leave behind a sealed manuscript with instructions that it not be opened until 2025. That manuscript was scheduled to be unsealed next year. 3 months ago, the university archive, where it was stored, reported a break-in. The manuscript was the only item taken, but Carver had been more strategic than her opponents realized. She had created copies, distributed to trusted individuals with instructions for their eventual publication. One of those copies reached me 2 weeks ago, forwarded by a colleague of Carver's who had recently been diagnosed with terminal cancer and didn't want to take certain secrets to his grave. What I found in those pages forced me to reevaluate everything I thought I knew about American Western expansion. The systematic victimization of vulnerable families, the deliberate orphaning of children, the theft of assets, the suppression of witnesses, the construction of historical narratives that obscured these crimes. And most disturbing of all, the continuation of these patterns into the present day. The manuscript included a data analysis of contemporary child welfare cases in 3 Northwest states, identifying statistical anomalies that mirrored the historical pattern. Families with sudden financial windfalls, inheritance, insurance settlements, successful business ventures, experienced disproportionate rates of intervention by Child Protective Services. Parents faced allegations that, while serious enough to justify removing their children, rarely resulted in criminal charges. Assets intended for these children's support were systematically depleted through questionable guardianship arrangements and administrative fees, and the children themselves were placed in foster or adoptive homes connected to the same network of families and institutions that had benefited from similar arrangements for generations. Because what began on the Oregon Trail didn't end there. The network evolved, adapted, incorporated itself into the institutional framework of the growing nation. Banks, land offices, courts, historical societies, academic institutions, all became vectors for the continuation of the original methodology. The specific techniques changed, but the underlying process remained the same. Identify vulnerable families with assets, engineer their removal, absorb and indoctrinate the children, appropriate the resources. The contemporary manifestations are harder to detect, but follow the same pattern. Foreclosure clusters that target specific demographic groups. Child Protective Services that disproportionately remove children from families with recently acquired assets or inheritances. Probate courts that mysteriously fail to locate next of kin when estates are settled. Academic and historical institutions that systematically marginalize or discredit researchers who identify these patterns. What makes this system so effective and so difficult to combat is its distributed nature. There is no central conspiracy, no single organization directing these activities. Rather, it's a complex, adaptive network of individuals and institutions bound together by shared interests and methodologies. Like any successful predatory system, it has evolved mechanisms to protect itself, the ability to identify and neutralize threats, to adapt to changing environments, to maintain operational security while expanding its reach. The most effective of these protective mechanisms is the cultivation of disbelief. The pattern is hidden in plain sight, but anyone who points it out risks being dismissed as paranoid, conspiracy-minded, methodologically unsound. The system relies on our collective unwillingness to recognize predatory patterns that operate across generations, our tendency to view historical events as disconnected from present circumstances. The Sager orphans were not an isolated tragedy. They were among the first documented cases of a predatory methodology that continues to this day, a methodology that relies on our unwillingness to recognize patterns that stretch across generations, our tendency to view historical events as disconnected from present circumstances. You might wonder why this matters now, nearly 2 centuries after Henry and Naomi Sager died on the trail to Oregon. It matters because the system that claimed them and scattered their children still operates today. It matters because the methodologies pioneered on the frontier have been refined and institutionalized. It matters because what happened to the Sagers and other families like them was not random misfortune but calculated exploitation, exploitation that established precedents and practices that continue to shape our society in ways we have failed to recognize. The 4 surviving Sager sisters carried the knowledge of this system in fragments. Catherine tried to expose it through her writing but was blocked. Elizabeth retreated into silence. Henrietta died young under suspicious circumstances. Only Matilda, who lived until 1928 and was the last surviving member of the family, continued to probe and question, though always carefully, always aware of the potential dangers. In her final years, Matilda established a small trust fund dedicated to preserving what remained of the Whitman mission site. Her stated purpose was to honor the memory of her adoptive parents and siblings who died there, but buried in the trust documents was a provision requiring periodic archaeological examination of the site. Examinations that might eventually uncover physical evidence of what really happened that November day in 1847. The trust remains active, though its purpose has been narrowed over time through legal challenges from parties who claimed concern for, quote, respecting the sanctity of the graves. I've spent the past 2 weeks verifying as much of Carver's research as possible. Many of the primary documents she cited have vanished from archives or been reclassified. Key witnesses have died or become unreachable. But enough evidence remains to establish the broad outlines of the pattern she identified. Most compelling is the statistical analysis of child welfare cases, property transfers, and probate proceedings in regions where the historical pattern was most active. The data reveals clusters of anomalies that cannot be explained by random chance or socioeconomic factors alone. These clusters correspond geographically to areas where the original network established itself in the mid-19th century, suggesting continuity of operation despite the passage of time and the evolution of methods. And now you know too. You become part of this story, a story that powerful interests have worked for generations to keep buried. They've manipulated historical records, silenced witnesses, discredited researchers, and constructed alternative narratives. They've counted on our collective inability to recognize patterns that span centuries, to connect distant events to present circumstances. But patterns, once recognized, cannot be unseen. The true story of the Sager family is not just a tragic frontier tale. It's a window into a system of predation that evolved alongside our national expansion. A system that didn't disappear, but rather became more sophisticated, more institutionalized, and consequently, more invisible. You may ask what can be done about a system so entrenched, so carefully insulated from exposure. The answer begins with recognition, the ability to see the pattern in current events, not just historical ones. It continues with documentation, the preservation of evidence that might otherwise be erased or altered. And it culminates in connection, the linking together of individuals who have recognized the same pattern, who can share information and provide mutual protection against the system's defensive mechanisms. This is why I've reached out to you. You are one of several people receiving copies of this account and the supporting documentation. Each recipient has been chosen for specific attributes: professional position, institutional access, personal connection to the pattern described. Together, you form a distributed network of awareness, too dispersed to be easily neutralized, too diverse to be uniformly discredited. Some of you will recognize elements of this pattern from your own experience or research. Others will find it alien, perhaps initially implausible. I ask only that you approach it with an open mind and a willingness to examine the evidence objectively. The supporting documentation includes statistical analyses, case studies, genealogical connections, and institutional histories that collectively support the pattern described here. Review it carefully. Verify what you can. Reach out to the other recipients when you're ready. As you drive the highways that now cover the Oregon Trail, passing through landscapes where thousands died in pursuit of a better life, remember the Sager children, not just as victims of frontier hardship, but as early casualties in a pattern of exploitation that continues to this day. Remember that what appears as random misfortune in individual cases may, when viewed collectively, reveal deliberate design. The wagon ruts have vanished, but the trail of exploitation they marked continues. Now you know to look for it. Now you know what to watch for. And knowledge, as those who've worked so hard to suppress this story well understand, is where resistance begins. Catherine Sager's original manuscript ended with a simple statement: "The truth refuses to remain buried forever." After nearly 2 centuries of systematic suppression, the truth about the Sager family and the system that claimed them is finally emerging into the light.